Hey, it's 2 a.m. and I'm having kind of a long day. So, this is my Bible study. I am back. We are back into it. We are in the home stretch. We are in Joseph's story. So, this will be chapter 39. I hope I'm remembering that number correctly because I did not write it down. All right. So, let's begin. Joseph in Potiphar's Egyptian household. And I will be reading from the CTS NCB based on the New Jerusalem Bible. That's a mouthful. First, the summary. Joseph was sold as a domestic slave to an Egyptian official, also called a courtier, a commander of the guard, or the chief steward of the pharaoh, or king. Originally to serve as a personal attendant, Joseph eventually rose to become manager of the household affairs for his master. In his position and circumstance, Joseph grew into a strong as well as a handsome man, and after some time, the wife of his master took a romantic and erotic interest in the man. Joseph, loyal to his master, who had treated him relatively well, refused the woman's advances and rebuffed her seductions. After one last rejection, in pettiness, she accused Joseph of trying to seduce her and of attempting to sleep with her, using a tunic she took from him as proof of her false accusations. The master, in his fury, had Joseph arrested and sentenced to the royal prison, here called the gaol or the roundhouse. But the chief gaoler, that is, the warden of the prison, took a liking to Joseph, and Joseph proved himself useful and popular, to the point that he had a role in the administrating of prisoners' work as an overseer. So that was the summary. What about the overview? This chapter seems to be influenced by the Egyptian tale, the story of two brothers, aka the tale of Anpu and Bada, a story set between 1200 and 1194 BC, during the New Kingdom of Egypt. While, just to be clear, the social norms and legal framework in Genesis pushes its account back to the 1500s BC. And the point in the historical record when the Hebrews actually were in any power in Egypt was between 1620 and 1545 BC. While Joseph's story, as we have it today, wasn't written down in a compiled form until at least 799 BC, sometime well before 586 BC. So, the distance from the first version of the Egyptian tale of two brothers to the influences we see in the Joseph story we have and read today is vast. At least 400 years, if not 1,000 years. That is a lot of time for a story to change and develop in the oral recitation, not to mention the cultural shifts and norms it would have been adapted to, going from Egypt to Canaan to Babylon and back again. As for the tale of Apnu and Bata, reading its very different account of a similar story to Joseph's fills in much of the missing character motivation and emotional gaps from the narrative of the Joseph story. This chapter centers around the themes of duty, loyalty, resistance to seduction, and endurance of false accusation. Loyalty here could also be piety. As well, there is some literary development in the storytelling with the introduction of the woman scorned motif. Notes. Verse number 5. And from the time he put him in charge of his household, out of consideration for Joseph, the Lord's blessing extended to all his possessions, both household and his estate. This expands on the established idea that God is Lord over the whole earth, not only the Jewish people, as we can read about in Psalms 97, verses 8 through 9. Let the rivers clap their hands, and the hills ring out their joy at the presence of the Lord. For he comes to rule the earth. He will rule the world with justice, and the people with fairness. To be fair, it actually says peoples, but I've never liked how people translate that. I never liked how scholars translate that. It always bothers me. It should just be people. People is already plural. Anyway, verse number 7. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and it happened some time later that his master's wife looked desirously at him and said, "Sleep with me." Some rabbis have interpreted this episode not as Joseph resisting temptation, but as a punishment for his narcissism and machismo as a teacher's pet. Then we get to verse 8. But he refused and answered his master's wife, "Because of me, my master does not concern himself with what happens in the house. He has handed over all his possessions to me." That is not to say that Joseph hasn't matured from the brash and thoughtless teenager he was back in chapter 37. He has grown in humility and responsibility. So one could view this episode and his adventure as trials to refine his character, as some Christian denominations do. Then we get to verse 9. He is no more master in this house than I am. He has withheld nothing from me, except yourself, because you are his wife. How could I do anything so wicked and sin against God? This verse is also the first time Joseph mentions God in his narrative. Verse 12. The woman caught hold of him by his tunic and said, "Sleep with me." But he left the tunic in her hand and ran out of the house. As a slave, Joseph was lower than a nobleman's wife and had no choice in the matter but to obey her. But he chose to do the right thing anyway, even though he would have to face negative consequences. The tunic in the master's wife's character is meant to contrast with that of Tamar from the previous chapter, who used these tools and skills, that is, boldness and seductiveness, for good, not for evil. The clothing also continues a theme favored by the writer of Genesis of using clothing to deceive husbands and fathers. Verse 14. She called her servants and said to them, "Look at this. He has brought us a Hebrew to insult us. He came to me to sleep with me, but I screamed." We see hatred for the Jews, here called the Hebrews, extends back to their earliest memories, as recorded in their stories of themselves. Verse 20. Joseph's master had him arrested and committed to the gaol, where the king's prisoners were kept, and there, in gaol, he stayed. The Bible, in both the Old and New Testament, promises persecution, not easiness of life, for those who choose to live righteously. Then we get to verse 23. The chief gaoler did not need to interfere with Joseph's administration, for the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything he undertook successful. The moral of the chapter is that God does not abandon those whom he loves, even when they are in bad circumstances. This verse is an example of God's will and man's will working in synergy, that is, grace and works. The concept and idea of God as a shield for those who worship him is explored further in Psalm 139. And usually by worship, the word that they use is faithful, by those who are faithful to him. All right, now, let me ask you a few questions. Yes, I want to bring back the questions, the question aspect to this series. Question number 1. Do you think this story is about resisting temptation as Catholics see it, or that this story is about a refinement of Joseph's character, as some rabbis have claimed? Question number 2. How do you think Joseph gained the opportunity to impress the gaoler? Question number 3. False accusations are a horrible tragedy that has life-altering significances to its victims. Why do you think the author included this detail in the story of Joseph's life? In the story of Joseph. All right, that is my Bible study. Welcome back. It's good to have you guys back here again. It was a good time. This can take a little bit of editing, but whatever. All right. So next week we got the NAB, and you know the drill. Like, subscribe, comment, respond if you want to. If you're going to respond in a video, put the link in my comments below. Ask me questions, correct me where you think I'm wrong. Let's have a conversation. Peace.